contains a copy of the Gospel of Mark that dates from around the year 220. Now, I'm not sure when Mark was written. Some people think it was written in the year 50, in the year 60, in the year 70. I think, my own opinion is that it was written sometime around the year 70. If that's the case, then our first surviving copy of Mark was produced 150 years after the original. Not from the original, but from copies of the 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 original. We don't have anything earlier for the Gospel of Mark. This is what P45 looks like. This is one page of P45. P45 has portions of 8 chapters of Mark. So this earliest copy of Mark doesn't have the whole thing. It has portions of half of the chapters of Mark. This is the earliest. As you can see, it's very fragmentary because it was discovered in Egypt and then eroded over the years. It's written in Greek. The original language of the Gospel of Mark is the original language of all the books of the New Testament. You can see, you probably get a good sense here. It's rather hard to read this because they don't put any separation between paragraphs or between sentences or even between words. They all run together one after the other, making it very easy indeed to make mistakes when you're trying to copy one of these texts. This, then, is the oldest copy of Mark, P45, from around the year 220. Our next earliest copy comes from the 4th century. Our first complete copy of the Gospel of Mark from beginning to end, from the first verse to the last verse, a copy of the New Testament that has the entire Mark, is from 300 years after Mark was copied originally. That's the situation we're facing when we're dealing with the manuscripts of the New Testament. Not just Mark, but all of our manuscripts. We're in the same boat. We don't have any of the originals. We don't have any original copies. We don't have any original copies of the copies. We have copies that were made many decades, in most cases many centuries later. And we know that there were changes made. How do we know? Because all of the copies differ from one another. Let me give you some statistics. How many copies do we have? Well, it's a little bit hard to say exactly how many copies we have of the New Testament, but we have something like 5,500 copies in Greek, the language in which they were originally written. Plus, we have thousands of copies in Latin, and we have copies in other ancient languages that people who are textual scholars learn when they're sort of into learning dead languages. They learn Syriac, and they learn Coptic, and they learn Gothic, and they learn Old Church Slavonic, and you've got manuscripts in all these languages. But in Greek, the original language of the New Testament, there are 5,500 or so manuscripts, from complete manuscripts to fragmentary copies, 5,500. So that's a lot. That's a lot. That's more than you have for any other book in the ancient world, so that part's good. That's the good news, is we have so many of these things. The bad news is that none of them goes back to the original, and all of them have mistakes in them. What can we say about the ages of our copies? Well, the oldest copy we have is another papyrus, P52. It's called because it was the 52nd papyrus found. This is a little scrap of the Gospel of John. It looks rather large here on the screen. In fact, it's the size of a credit card. It's the size of a credit card written on front and back, which is important to know because since it's written on front and back, it means it came from, not from a scroll, the way most people wrote ancient books, but from a codex, from like our books, where you write on both sides of the page and bind them together into a book. It's a little bit hard to date a fragment like this. Experts in ancient handwriting, who are called paleographers, who do this for a living, paleographers date this thing probably to the first half of the 2nd century. So maybe 30, 40, 50 years after John was originally written, plus or minus 25 years. You don't really know exactly when something like this was written, but maybe 125, plus or minus 25 years. This is it's a very important piece that it's a very important piece, this P52. It's an account of the trial before Pilate in the Gospel of John, with a few words from the trial here at the beginning, and on the back side, if you were to flip this over, you'd see some more words. And so this is a very interesting little fragment, and it's the earliest thing we have of anything from the New Testament from maybe 30 or 40 years after John was originally written. Most of our manuscripts are nowhere near that early. 94% of the manuscripts that we now have, Greek manuscripts, date from after the 9th century. The 9th century, after the 9th century. So 800, 900 years after the originals is when we start getting lots of copies. So you'll sometimes have people tell you that the New Testament is the best attested book from the ancient world, and they're absolutely right. It is absolutely the best attested book from the ancient world. The problem is the attestation to the book comes centuries after it was originally written. Many, many, many centuries after originally written is when most of our manuscripts come from. Well, okay, so we have all these manuscripts. How many mistakes are found in those manuscripts exactly? Well, during the Middle Ages, people didn't think much about this. I mean, scribes who were copying the text realized that that their predecessors had made mistakes, and they occasionally would notice mistakes, but they didn't think much of it. People didn't start thinking much of it until the invention of printing, when printers had to actually print a verse and had to decide what words to print in the verse. And the problem is, if they had different manuscripts with different words in each verse, then they had to decide, well, which words are the original words? And which words do we want to print? How do we know? Because we have all these manuscripts that have differences in them. And so it wasn't until the invention of printing that people started thinking about this seriously, and it didn't become a real issue until almost exactly 300 years ago, the year 1707. In the year 1707, there was a scholar at Oxford named John Mill, unrelated to John Stuart Mill, the Victorian that some of you know about. This John Mill was a textual scholar of the New Testament. He spent 30 years of his life studying the manuscripts of the New Testament. He had access to about 100 manuscripts of the New Testament, and he studied them thoroughly, and then he put together a book. He called it the Novum Testamentum Graeci, the Greek New Testament of John Mill in 1707. And what he did in this Greek New Testament is he printed a line or two of the Greek verses from the New Testament, Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, verse 2, verse 3. But then at the bottom of the page, he listed places where the manuscripts had differences for every verse. To the shock and dismay of his readers, John Mill's Greek New Testament listed 30,000 places where the manuscripts disagreed with one another. 30,000 places of variation among the manuscripts. Now, some of his detractors were quite upset by this and claimed that John Mill had published his Novum Testament Graeci in order to render the text of the New Testament uncertain. They thought this was some kind of demonic plot on the part of a university professor. But his supporters pointed out he hadn't actually invented these 30,000 places of variation. He just noticed that they exist, as they do exist in our manuscripts. Well, that was 300 years ago, based on a study of 100 manuscripts. Now we have over 5,500 manuscripts, which have been studied quite assiduously by scholars, although they have not been thoroughly studied yet. What can we say about the number of variations today among our manuscripts of the New Testament? The reality is we don't know how many changes scribes made in their texts of the New Testament. We don't know because nobody has been able to add up all the numbers yet. Even with the development of computer technology, we don't know how many differences there are. There are scholars who will tell you that there are 300,000 differences, scholars who will tell you there